I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast. Rob, today we are going about 1,000 years back.
In the way back machine.
To
the Song Dynasty.
The Song Dynasty.
We're 11th century.
Yeah, 1080s,
yes.
1070s.
The great reformer and poet, Wang Anshi. Wang Anshi is another of the many, many figures that we're only now getting to, and maybe we should have gotten to earlier. I don't know. He's a giant. Literally, there's a term. He's one of the 8 giants. The Tang Song Ba Da Jia, like the big dudes in the Tang and the Song, right? Not just politicians, but writers as well.
And he's more of a politician than a writer. I mean, to be a politician in this day and age, during the Tang and the Song, really, you had to be a poet.
Yes. Yeah, to some extent, yes. Although what's interesting about Wang Anshi is that he's one of the rare figures who was in some ways equally influential in both. You typically have to choose, right? If you're a great statesman, maybe you write a little bit and we sort of read what you wrote through the lens of your statesmanship, or vice versa, right?
We're doing a 2-part series, Wang Anshi and Sudongpo. And I would actually argue that Sudongpo, as a politician, was less influential, but as a writer, he's much more influential. Wang Anshi, I would say, as a politician, is more influential, but less influential as a poet. And it's important because we're doing this as a series because they don't get along real well.
No, they do not. Now, just to give the listener here just a super quick background, we're looking at 11th century Song Dynasty. Wang Anshi kind of embodies in a lot of ways this type, I suppose you could say. There's a sort of a romantic type in Chinese history and literature of like the sage who descends from the mountaintop to intervene in human affairs and then goes back to the mountaintop in their old age to contemplate eternity. This is kind of one of Wang Anshi's popular presentations. His poetry is very, very... I'm trying to think of a good, simple way to describe it. Very simple, nature-focused, sort of Tao Yuan Ming, but far more melancholy. He usually writes in quatrains, very short, sparse poetry. Very beautiful, I think. We'll talk about that in a minute. Anyway, as a statesman and reformer, he was a radical. Most of his reforms that he put through, or tried to put through in some cases, were designed to sort of give a square deal to the peasant. I almost said level the playing field, but there's really no leveling of a playing field like this.
He actually gave money to peasants. He took tax, like government wealth, and gave money to peasants. His green sprout law was essentially a kind of welfare to the peasants, and it loaned them money so that they could buy seeds, and it did lots of kind of, I think the term you were going to use but didn't, leveling the playing field, that's maybe leveling the farming field.
Could be.
But he is definitely a radical, and things didn't work out super well for him.
No, and it's interesting. I want to just hit a couple of these other laws here, though. There's a labor recruitment law, which was huge, right? Instead of having corvée labor, you have paid labor. Part of Wang Anshi's point, though, was not a sort of romantic espousal of the cause of the peasant, so much as a sense of practicality. Like, look, if we want the empire to be strong, right, then the people who form the bulk of its muscle should be healthy, right, and well taken care of. Because if you have soldiers who hate you and aren't well fed, or laborers who are ready to rise up at a moment's notice, then that's not going to go well for you. What if we took care of them? Maybe the empire would be stronger.
Yeah, so 1069, he reaches the height of power in the Chinese bureaucracy, and he implements what are called the Xinzheng, the new policies, the reforms. These laws kind of offer peasants a lot more economic assistance. I don't want to get too into the politics and comparing it to American politics, but you can think of these as kind of welfare reforms, LBJ style, Great Society, similar
FDR,
like the Song Dynasty equivalent to those things.
Yeah.
Now, I mentioned the poet who I like more and think is more influential than Wang Anshi, and that's Sudongpo. Sudongpo, which we're going to talk about
next time,
is he's a conservative, and he and lots of other conservatives absolutely hated what Wang Anshi was doing.
Again, as did any conservatives with FDR and anyone else with a Great Society idea in America.
I don't know if we can kind of...
That's extending the comparison a little too far, but
and I'm going to extend it even more too far and say that if Wang Anshi is kind of in the LBJ camp, then Sudongpo is maybe the Reaganite counter-revolution.
Yeah, that's tough, man. I think having our listeners choose between Reagan as a poet or LBJ as a poet may be a bridge too far.
But we're going to go, that's the Chinese literature podcast. We can
That's it. We can do, it's our podcast. We can do whatever we want.
So Wang Anshi equals LBJ or FDR. Sudongpo is Reagan.
Phew. See, right there, you made me not even want to read Sudongpo. But anyway. Now, the other one I want to throw in there simply because I remember it kind of vividly from a seminar I took here on classical Chinese was there's a series of correspondences between Wang Anshi and the Shenzong Emperor about the imperial exam. And based largely on Wang Anshi's recommendation, the emperor decides to ditch the classicist focus of the exams. So before that, if you wanted to be a smart person and get a job in the civil bureaucracy, you had to show your command of the Confucian classics, usually in poetic form, or you had to at least show you knew your poetry, right? Wang Anshi, and I'm paraphrasing here because he and the emperor exchanged quite a few correspondences, essentially says to the emperor, here's the thing. A poet who's really good at poetry doesn't necessarily know anything about how to administer the state or anything else.
So he was being pragmatic.
He was being very pragmatic and saying, if we want things to work, you got to have people who can actually give us some helpful ideas. The emperor goes, that's a pretty good idea. Let's do that. So the exam topic of that year, exam candidates file into the hall. Everyone has been well-versed in the classics. They've moved up through the ranks of the exam system. They've written their poetry. They sit down at their tables. And the question is a version of, if we have this gigantic problem in the hinterland somewhere in China, what would you say we should do about it? And all the candidates panic because it would be like if you've been studying, you're ready for your comps in a PhD program and you sit down and they give you a trigonometry problem and you'd go, what is this? It's almost that dramatic. But this is the kind of reformer he was. Not surprisingly, once he ascends back to his mountaintop, because he does retire from public life and go back.
Well, he's pushed out.
Yeah. Okay, fair enough. He's pushed out.
I believe the conservatives essentially push him out.
Right.
Actually, Wang Anshi was kind of cutthroat himself because I think he actually took Sudongpo and banished him to the barbaric lands to the south that are today Guangdong.
The barbaric lands. Jeez.
I mean, that's how they would
Yeah. No, it's just
them.
That's a longer discussion. Where would you rather be? But it doesn't go well for him. Basically, everything he puts forward as a reform gets overturned, and that's it. Now,
the reforms last for about 6 years, I want to say.
Not
5
long.
years.
Not very long. Now, Wang Anshi's poetry, based on everything we've just said, is really, really interesting, I think. I will withhold judgment about which I prefer, him or Sudongpo, as a poet later. But I find his poetry very, very beautiful, resistant to any kind of easy reading. I'm going to read one example real quick of a straightforward, I think, poem. It's called Reading History. I'm working on translations here by David Hinton. And this is it's a pretty short one, so I'll just read his poem. It says, "Renowned achievement's been bitter business from the beginning. Who can you trust to tell the story of all you've done and not done? Whatever happens is already murky enough and full of distortion. Then small minds muddle the truth further and it's utter confusion. They only hand down dregs. Their azure green and cinnabar inks can't capture the fresh kernel of things, the quintessential spirit. And how could they fathom a lofty sage's thoughts, those mindless sentinels guarding thousand autumn dust on their pages of paper?" Not the most subtle poem in the canon. The idea, of course, being, look, I'm the sage, and those stupid people down there who threw me out don't know what's what. I never will, because all they do is shuffle papers and write about stuff.
There's obviously like this this parallel to his political life, I think you're hitting on really well. So I wanted to point something out. So not only is this parallel Wang Anshi's political career quite well, where you have these conservative gatekeepers who are kind of resisting change and keeping him out from achieving his goals, but also this is actually how history worked for Wang Anshi. No one, like, Wang Anshi has been hugely debated in the literature of China and the historiography of China up to the present day. He's a big topic in debates between communists, which is not surprising because, you can see what he's doing as subsidizing the peasants, which is what a lot of communists claimed they were going to do. Of course, when it actually came time in the 1950s, 1960s, they actually were taxing peasants much more than they taxed urban areas. I think this is interesting that Wang Anshi is able to kind of see into the future and see how his role will be debated in history.
It is all of that, and even the terms, I would argue, are similar. So you have this line here, their azure green and cinnabar inks can't capture the fresh kernel of things, the quintessential spirit. So far as I understand, what he's talking about here is the ability to afford sort of exotic inks to write in, right? So these are people who are less concerned about the substance of what they're writing than how good they look when they write it. So wealthy, know-nothing, sit off by themselves statesmen writing about what's really happening, right?
Again, we have a political parallel.
Exactly.
Right? Like, he is doing these kind of welfare reform things.
Yes.
And they're being resisted by the folks who can afford this kind of expensive ink. And in history, he's also going to be resisted by those very same conservatives.
Right, exactly. But it's interesting. This is a glimpse of the kind of poet he was, though. To stress the kind of ink they're using is effective, but it's also a little more subtle than just saying outright, rich people don't get me, right?
It's a metonymy, right?
Yeah. Now, the rest of his little commentary in here is I would say, equally straightforward. I wanted to finish the thought that I didn't finish a second ago, but in terms of comparing him to sort of later communist arguments. Once again, one of the things that Mao and others say, Mao himself being famously a poet, is that you can't know this stuff. You can't truly understand it unless you're down in the mud talking to people and learning from them. Now, Wang Anshi isn't necessarily saying, hey, let's all go live in the countryside. What he is saying is, if you set yourself apart with your money, you're not going to understand what's happening.
Rob, so I really like this poem for a lot of reasons, but you've mentioned that it's very straightforward. Other than the metonymy, there's not really any kind of question about what his message is, right?
Right.
How much... So when I read this poem, I think it's interesting as a historical artifact, but I'm less interested in it as a poem.
Right.
Which is interesting because that also plays into the politics, because Sudongpo, I think, is a much better poet. He's also a conservative, but he has this kind of emphasis on like highly classically oriented training, the kind of training that Wang Anshi sort of tried to push to the side with his exam reforms. But Sudongpo is much more interesting as a poet because he is constantly engaging in these classical allusions, and also aesthetically, I think Sudongpo really hits it out of the park in a way that Wang Anshi is just not doing that. He's so straightforward. In terms of aesthetics, it's not beautiful poetry.
See, I would have to totally disagree on that last one, because this is if all you read of Wang Anshi was reading history, yes, you'd have a point. But if you read the rest of his poems, that's absolutely not the case, I would say. One of the other poems you and I had looked at is a poem just called Hymn, 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 which reads this way: Dawn lights up the room. I close my book and sleep, dreaming of Bell Mountain and full of tenderness. How do you grow old living with failure and disgrace? Just go back to the cascading creek, cold, shimmering. For me, that's a far more subtle poem because, first of all, you have a kind of classic scene-setting line that I think of in the best of the Tang Dynasty poets, where it's simply there to communicate an image. It's not a commentary necessarily. I suppose you could think of it that way. But dawn lights up the room. I close my book and sleep. First of all, he's sleeping at dawn. Not at dusk, but at dawn. So he's been up all night, possibly worrying. We don't know. Doesn't matter because we can
reading.
Yeah, but I mean, why read all night? Why not simply sleep like every other human being, right? There's lots of things there that we don't even know. Dreaming of Bell Mountain and full of tenderness towards Bell Mountain, towards his life, we don't know. The line, how do you grow old living with failure and disgrace, is a straightforward question in that it's not hard to understand what he's asking. But then the next line, just go back to the cascading creek, cold, shimmering. I just find that line beautiful because there's nothing in that line that tells you that it's going to solve any of the problems or answer the question, how do you grow old living with failure and disgrace? Just go to the creek, meaning what?
I definitely think this poem is more beautiful than reading history, even though I think reading history is more interesting.
From a political and historical sense.
Yeah. What I would say is, though, even that last line, how do you grow old living with failure and disgrace? Just go back to the cascading creek, cold, shimmering. I think that, I mean, we haven't talked about this, but Wang Anshi was a practicing Chan Buddhist, right?
Yes.
So, I mean, even there, I don't think there's any real mystery to what he was talking about. I mean, he's talking about kind of embedding himself in nature and this meditative practice that is an important component of Chan Buddhism. Chan Buddhism, by the way, is just
Zen Buddhism.
Zen, yeah. I was going to say that it's the same thing, but actually Zen is derived from Chan Buddhism, although, the Japanese have taken it in their own direction. I don't think there's actually any mystery to these last two lines. I mean, he's just kind of like locating himself in this Buddhist meditative space.
But the problem with what you just said is to say that any line then that advocates returning to a meditative space doesn't need to be interpreted at all. We just say, well, he's just talking about Buddhism. What I find interesting about that line is, as in any classical poem where there's only a handful of lines and every single character has to be very carefully chosen. If you're only writing 2 lines, you can't throw fluff in there. A lot of Song Dynasty poem has a lot of fluff because it's long and wordy.
Not this poem.
Not this poem. Now, granted, the words I'm commenting on are not exactly the Chinese word. This is a translation. But why cascading creek? You could just say creek. What does cascading have to do with it? Why does it matter that it's cold, shimmering? Each of these little details is meant to communicate something besides just, go to nature, you'll find your answer, moving on. So we'll get to Sudongpo next time. I would simply say here that we're looking at some of the more interesting figures in Chinese history. I'm glad we're finally getting to some of these guys.
Several years ago, we had someone request us do a ci, which is a form of poetry that develops actually slightly before the Song, kind of the late Tang, and it really kind of takes off, and it's associated today with the Song.
Yeah.
This is not a ci.
Absolutely not.
We've kind of, because you and I are not at all experts on Song Dynasty anything, we've kind of avoided that because Song poetry has this reputation of kind of being the redheaded stepchild of Tang poetry, which is just the glory of Chinese poetry. But I'm really glad we're actually going to do this short little kind of series
stint.
Yeah, that really tackles some great poets in the Song Dynasty.
And what's really, I think, worth remembering here is you have, I'm going to say, equally skilled poets, at least equally renowned poets, who were also powerful statesmen, politician poets who were accomplished in both, but who occupied completely different parts of the political spectrum, and yet were dealing with the same art form. I find that fascinating for a lot of reasons, but I think we'll talk about more of that when we get to Sudongpo later.
So until that point, we'll leave you with a poetic duel. LBJ versus Reagan.
Ooh, yikes.
I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.